Elias Carter had been stationed on Velthera for 6 months. As a human diplomat, his job was mostly about keeping relations smooth between Earth and the Veltheran people. Unlike humans, Veltherans were taller, their skin shimmered slightly under the twin suns, and their golden eyes held a depth that made them seem unreadable. Though they were peaceful, their customs were complex, and Elias had spent most of his time learning their ways to avoid making mistakes. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that morning. He was in his quarters when a Veltheran guard knocked at his door. The guard, a stern-looking warrior named Ferran, bowed slightly before speaking. "Ambassador Carter, you have been summoned by Princess Soraya. She has chosen you as her official assistant for the season." Elias blinked. The season. Toron hesitated for a moment, then said, "Her transition. It is an honor beyond measure. You must come at once." Elias had heard about the Veltheran's seasonal transition, but only in passing. It was something their ruling class went through, a kind of personal trial that marked their readiness for leadership. He had assumed it was some kind of ceremonial isolation, like meditation or fasting. But why would Soraya choose him? Still, declining wasn't an option. When a Veltheran noble made a request, it was expected to be accepted. Elias followed Toron through the towering halls of the palace. The architecture of Velthera was breathtaking, smooth ivory-like walls, glowing crystal pathways, and floating orbs of soft light that moved like fireflies. He had seen it 100 times, yet it still felt like stepping into a dream. At last, they arrived at an ornate chamber guarded by 2 towering sentries. The doors slid open silently, revealing Princess Soraya standing in the center of the room. She was unlike any Veltheran Elias had met. Her royal markings glowed faintly along her arms, and her gaze was sharp yet distant, as if she were trying to see beyond the present moment. "You have come," she said, her voice smooth but firm. Elias gave a respectful bow. "I was told you needed my assistance, Princess, but I'm not sure I understand what is required of me." Soraya studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, tilting her head slightly. "You are human, resilient, steady. That is why I chose you. This transition is difficult, and it requires someone who will not falter." Elias frowned slightly. What exactly does this transition involve? She exhaled softly, as if choosing her words carefully. "My mind and body will be unsettled. I will be vulnerable, and my emotions may be unstable. This is a test of my control, but also of my strength. If I endure it, I will be seen as worthy to rule." Elias nodded slowly. "And you want me to help with that?" "Yes," she said. "Your presence will anchor me." It still didn't make complete sense to him, but if this was part of her traditions, he would do his duty. That was why he was here. After all, to build trust, to understand. "All right," he said. "I'll do my best." Soraya's golden eyes flashed with something unreadable, relief, perhaps, or something deeper. "Then it is decided." Elias had no idea what he had just agreed to, but something told him that this was just the beginning. Elias sat quietly in the princess's chamber, unsure of what to expect. The room was dimly lit, filled with the soft hum of energy flowing through the crystal walls. The air itself seemed to pulse with something unseen, something ancient and powerful. Soraya stood in the center, her posture still and controlled, but her breathing was slower than before. She had explained that her transition was a test, a trial that every Veltheran ruler must endure, but she had not explained why she needed him specifically. Elias cleared his throat. "So, what do I actually do?" Soraya's golden eyes flickered toward him. "You stay. That's it. For now." Elias had expected rituals, strange tasks, or some kind of formal duty, but instead, he was just sitting there, watching the princess as she closed her eyes and steadied herself. The silence stretched between them. He shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. If this was what she needed, he would do his job. Then, something changed. A faint glow spread across her skin, like soft golden cracks appearing beneath the surface. Her breathing quickened. Her fingers twitched, curling as if she were grasping something invisible. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, leaning forward. Soraya exhaled sharply, her voice low. "It's beginning." A wave of strange energy rippled through the room, making the air feel heavy. Elias felt it against his skin, a warmth pressing against him, like standing too close to a fire. Soraya clenched her jaw. "The first phase is instability. My mind will resist. My body will react." Elias frowned. "React how?" Before she could answer, her legs buckled. Elias sprang forward without thinking, catching her before she collapsed. The moment his hands touched her, a shock ran through him. Not painful, but overwhelming, as if something inside him had just clicked into place. His vision blurred for half a second, and suddenly, he felt Soraya's emotions crashing into him like a storm. Fear, pain, uncertainty. It wasn't just that he could see her struggling, he could feel it. Elias gasped and let go, stepping back quickly. What was that? Soraya straightened herself, breathing heavily. "The bond. It's forming." Elias shook his head. "What bond?" She looked at him, something deep and unreadable in her gaze. A Veltheran ruler does not endure transition alone. The one who assists them must share the burden. Elias's stomach twisted. "You didn't mention that part." Soraya's expression didn't change, because once the bond begins, it cannot be undone. Elias stared at her, realization sinking in. He wasn't just helping her. He was tied to her now, in a way he didn't understand. And there was no turning back. "You said, Part 3 to 800 words ka leko or interesting huna cheo, or third-person style malekniha or simple basic English ka. Don't use any violated word. So please avoid any violated content." ChatGPT said, Part 3. A royal decree. His fate is sealed. Elias's breath felt heavy as the weight of Soraya's words sank in. The bond cannot be undone. He had thought he was just assisting her through a temporary phase, something ceremonial, something that would end in a few days. But now it sounded like he was part of something permanent, something far beyond what he had agreed to. He ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to stay calm. "Okay, let's take a step back. What do you mean the bond is forming? What exactly does that mean for me?" Soraya took a slow breath, her golden eyes watching him carefully. "It means our minds and energy have begun to synchronize. It is the way of my people. A Veltheran ruler does not endure transition alone. The one who assists them becomes linked." "Linked," Elias repeated, as in mentally. She gave a small nod. "In a way, yes. Your presence will steady me, and in return, I will share my strength with you." Elias didn't like the sound of that. But what if I don't want this bond? Soraya's gaze didn't waver. "It is not a choice. It has already begun." His hands clenched into fists. He had been careful since arriving on Velthera, always respecting their culture, always avoiding offense. But this was too much. "Soraya, with all due respect, this wasn't part of the deal." His voice was firm, but not aggressive. "I agreed to help you through this process. I didn't agree to, whatever this is." Soraya's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, something almost like regret. "I understand that you were unaware. I should have told you sooner." Elias let out a frustrated breath. "Then undo it. There has to be a way to break this connection." Silence. Soraya looked away. Elias felt a sinking feeling in his chest. "Soraya," she sighed, "the bond is sacred among my people. There is no way to sever it without—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Without consequences." "Consequences," Elias repeated. "What kind of consequences?" She turned her gaze back to him, and for the first time, he saw a trace of vulnerability in her usually composed expression. "If the bond is forcibly broken, it will weaken us both. It could leave me unfit to rule. And for you, She trailed off. Elias stiffened. For me? What? She hesitated before answering. You could suffer permanent damage to your mind, your emotions, your energy. The bond, once formed, becomes part of you. Elias exhaled sharply, stepping away. He felt like the walls were closing in on him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something irreversible. Before he could say anything else, the doors to Soraya's chamber suddenly slid open. A group of Veltheran royal advisors entered, their expressions solemn. They were dressed in ceremonial robes, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. At their head was High Counselor Mavos, a stern figure with sharp features and an air of absolute authority. Princess Soraya, Mavos said, bowing slightly. It is time. Soraya straightened, masking whatever emotion she had shown just moments ago. I am aware. Mavos's gaze flickered toward Elias. And this is the one you have chosen. Soraya nodded once. Yes, he is my anchor. Elias's stomach twisted. The way she said it, so final, so certain, made it feel like his fate had already been decided. Mavos studied him carefully before speaking again. Then it is declared. The human, Elias Carter, is now bound to the royal house of Velthera. His duty is to stand by the princess, to share her burdens, and to remain at her side for as long as she reigns. Elias's heart pounded. Wait, what? The advisors barely spared him a glance. To them, this was already sealed in tradition. He turned back to Soraya, his voice low but urgent. Soraya, tell them this is a mistake. Tell them I can leave when this is over. Soraya hesitated, but before she could respond, Mavos spoke again. There is no mistake. The bond has been witnessed. You belong to the princess now. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. No way out. He had come here as a diplomat. Now he was something else entirely. And there was no escaping it. Elias sat in the royal chamber, his mind racing. The words of High Counselor Mavos echoed in his head. You belong to the princess now. How had this happened? Just a day ago, he was a diplomat representing Earth, navigating Veltheran customs and ensuring peaceful relations. Now he was trapped, bound to a princess through a mysterious bond he didn't fully understand. Soraya sat across from him, watching him with calm golden eyes. She had been silent since the royal decree, as if she knew he was struggling to accept the truth. Elias finally exhaled sharply. There has to be a way out of this. Soraya's gaze didn't waver. There isn't. That's not an answer, Elias said, frustration creeping into his voice. You're a princess. You have power. If you tell them I'm free to go, they'll listen. Soraya lowered her gaze for the first time. Even I cannot change this, Elias. The bond has been witnessed. To break it would mean dishonor. And more than that. She hesitated. It could harm you. Elias let out a dry laugh. You keep saying that, but no one is explaining why. He leaned forward, his voice firm, but not aggressive. Tell me, Soraya, what does this bond actually do to me? She studied him for a moment before speaking. It connects us, not just in presence, but in energy and thought. You felt it before when you caught me. A glimpse of my emotions. Elias tensed as he remembered the overwhelming sensation that had flooded his mind when he touched her. Soraya continued. The bond strengthens with time. Soon, you will not just feel my emotions, you will begin to anticipate them. You will know my pain as if it were your own, and I will feel yours. Elias stared at her, his hands curling into fists. That sounds a lot like losing control over myself. Soraya shook her head. No, it is not control. It is connection, and it is something sacred to my people. Elias pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to think. All right, let's say I accept that. What happens if I still try to leave? Soraya's expression darkened slightly. You won't be able to. Elias frowned. What does that mean? Before she could answer, the doors to the chamber opened. 2 Veltheran guards entered. Ambassador Carter, one of them said, "You are to remain within the royal palace until further notice. Travel outside is restricted." Elias felt a jolt of anger. "Restricted? You mean I'm under house arrest?" The guards did not react to his tone. "This is the law. It is for your protection." "For my protection." Elias clenched his jaw. "And if I try to leave?" The guard's expression remained neutral. "Then we will stop you." Elias turned to Soraya. "You're really going to let them do this? Keep me locked here like a prisoner?" Soraya met his gaze. "You are not a prisoner, Elias. You are bound." "That's the same thing." Elias snapped, pushing back his chair and standing up. "I didn't agree to this. I came here as a diplomat, not to be tied to a princess and kept behind palace walls." Soraya stood as well, her golden eyes sharp but not unkind. "And yet, you are here." Elias exhaled through his nose, trying to steady himself. He was getting nowhere. Fine. If they wouldn't let him leave through official means, he'd find another way. But deep down, he knew escape wouldn't be easy. And something in Soraya's expression told him that she wouldn't let him go so easily either. Elias paced back and forth in his chamber, his frustration growing with each step. The guards outside his door stood motionless, making it clear that leaving was not an option. He had spent the last few days trying to find a way out, but every path was blocked. The palace security was tight, and the moment he even attempted to leave the royal grounds, the guards gently but firmly redirected him back. No aggression, no violence, just an unyielding wall of tradition and duty. Aunt Soraya, she had remained calm, unreadable, as if she knew this would happen. "You are bound." The words echoed in his head. He couldn't accept it. He refused to accept it. Then, without warning, the palace alarms blared. Elias froze. The deep, resonating chime vibrated through the walls, a sound he had never heard before. He turned toward the door just as it slid open on its own. A Veltheran guard rushed inside, his expression urgent. "Ambassador Carter, you must come at once." Elias's first instinct was to demand answers, but something in the guard's tone and posture told him that this wasn't a simple request. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, he followed the guard through the winding palace corridors. The halls, which were usually peaceful and orderly, were now filled with rushing soldiers and palace staff moving with purposeful urgency. Elias's gut tightened. What's happening? The guard kept moving but answered swiftly. An attack. Assassins have breached the outer defenses. Their target is Princess Soraya. Elias's heart stopped for a second, then started pounding in his chest. Soraya. His mind raced. How? The palace security was nearly impenetrable. Who would dare attack the princess inside her own home? As they approached the grand hall, Elias's questions didn't matter anymore, because chaos had already begun. The attack. A group of masked figures moved with deadly precision, cutting down palace guards with silent, efficient strikes. Veltheran warriors engaged them, but the assassins were fast, skilled, and merciless. In the center of the hall, Soraya stood tall, her golden eyes glowing as she defended herself. She moved with fluid grace, her energy pulsing in waves, throwing attackers back with each strike. But she was outnumbered. Elias barely had time to think. His body moved on instinct. Grabbing a fallen guard's weapon, a sleek Veltheran energy staff, he rushed into the fray. An assassin lunged toward Soraya's unguarded side. Elias blocked the attack, the impact sending vibrations up his arms. The assassin twisted, surprised by his interference, and Elias took the opening, slamming the staff into their ribs, sending them sprawling. Soraya's gaze snapped to him, shock flashing across her face. "Elias, don't just stand there," he panted, gripping the staff. "I thought I was your anchor, or whatever. Let's finish this." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed over her expression. Then she moved in sync with him. The battle turns. Elias fought as best as he could, relying on his human reflexes and instincts. He wasn't as fast as the assassins, but he was resourceful, grabbing weapons off fallen guards, using the environment, staying unpredictable. Soraya, on the other hand, was a force of nature. Every motion she made was precise, effortless, her energy strikes tearing through the assassins. Her eyes glowed brighter, and Elias felt the bond between them strengthening. He could sense her rage, her focus, her determination, and strangely, she could feel his too. The assassins started to fall back, realizing their mission had failed. A few managed to retreat, disappearing into the palace shadows. The rest lay motionless on the floor. The attack was over. A realization. Elias stood there, breathing hard, gripping the staff. His arms ached, his pulse hammered, but the adrenaline still burned in his veins. Soraya turned to him, stepping closer. "You protected me." Elias swallowed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah. Well, I wasn't about to let you die, while I just stood around." For the first time since he met her, Soraya's calm mask cracked. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You truly do not abandon those you are bound to," she murmured. Elias let out a dry chuckle. "Guess not." Soraya studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps this bond is not a curse after all." Elias sighed, shaking his head, still not happy about it. Soraya's lips twitched in what might have been the smallest hint of a smile. "But you did not run." Elias looked away, exhaling. Maybe running isn't always the answer. Something between them shifted in that moment. The bond was no longer just something forced upon him. It was something he had chosen to protect. The aftermath of the attack left the palace in a state of uneasy calm. The halls that had once been filled with the sounds of celebration and peaceful conversations were now filled with silent tension. Guards moved through the corridors, inspecting each room, while medical staff attended to the wounded. Elias stood at the edge of the grand hall, his mind still spinning from the events that had unfolded. His hands were still slightly shaking from the adrenaline of the fight. He had never imagined that his life would take such an unexpected turn. Beside him, Soraya had begun issuing orders to the palace staff, her calm and commanding presence immediately putting everyone to work. She had shifted back into her royal role with practiced ease, but Elias noticed that there was something different about the way she moved now. Something was shifting between them, though neither of them spoke of it directly. Finally, Soraya turned to Elias. Her golden eyes were intense, but there was a hint of something else, something deeper behind them. "You did well today," she said quietly. "You protected me when I needed it most." Elias shrugged, not fully understanding why her gratitude felt different. "I couldn't let them take you. You're the one who's been taking care of this planet after all." Soraya's lips curved ever so slightly. "It's more than just the planet, Elias." His gaze snapped to hers. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I meant what I said before. You are my anchor." She paused, then added, "But I did not choose you simply out of duty. I chose you because I saw in you something different from what I expected, something my people could not offer me." Elias frowned. "I don't understand. What's so different about me?" Soraya's expression softened. "You don't have the same cultural constraints as my people. You think differently. You are not bound by tradition or expectation. And you do not hesitate to act on what you believe is right." Elias felt a sense of realization slowly starting to settle over him. "So you didn't just choose me to help you with your transition?" "No," she said softly. "I chose you because I saw in you something my people lack, a capacity for genuine connection." Elias's mind raced as he processed her words. He had thought all along that the bond between them was something forced on him, something he had no control over. But hearing Soraya speak now with such honesty, it was clear that she valued him for more than just his help. "You don't need to stay, Elias," Soraya said, breaking into his thoughts. "I will not force you. But understand this. This bond is not just a duty, it is a connection that neither of us can undo. Her words hit him like a wave, knocking him off balance. The thought of leaving had been at the back of his mind ever since he learned the full extent of the bond between them. He had wanted to walk away, to return to Earth, to put this all behind him. But now he wasn't sure anymore. Soraya continued, her gaze unwavering. You are not just my assistant, Elias. You are my partner in every sense of the word. And I know that this bond will change us both, but perhaps that is not such a terrible thing. Elias's heart beat faster. But what does this mean for me? For my future? Soraya took a slow step closer, her presence overwhelming in the most unspoken way. It means that you are no longer just an outsider. You are part of my world now, Elias. And you have a choice. He blinked, confused. A choice? What kind of choice? She smiled faintly, her voice low. You can choose to remain with me. Help me lead, help me rule this planet, and be with me as I fulfill my duties. Or you can choose to leave, return to your life, and forget this ever happened. Elias stared at her, his mind battling between two options. He had always thought of himself as someone who needed to maintain control, someone who never let his emotions dictate his actions. But now, with Soraya standing before him, so certain and yet so vulnerable, the walls he had built around himself felt like they were starting to crack. Elias began, but his voice caught. He didn't know how to finish that sentence. Could he really leave her? Could he walk away from the bond they had formed, from the experiences they had shared, from the connection that seemed to pulse between them? Soraya was watching him carefully, as if she already knew the answer. You don't need to decide now, but understand this, Elias. If you choose to stay, you will be bound to me, not just as my assistant, but as my equal. Elias took a step back, his thoughts a whirlwind. His life, the one he had known for years, was no longer a simple path. He had thought he understood his place in the universe, but now it felt like everything had changed in an instant. Could he truly become a partner to a princess, bound to her in a way that neither of them could undo? Could he become part of something greater than himself? Soraya took one last step toward him, her gaze searching his. What will you choose, Elias? And for the first time in days, Elias found himself without an answer. The days following Soraya's confession were filled with confusion and uncertainty. Elias found himself caught between two worlds, one where he was a diplomat, an outsider, and one where he was becoming something more to a princess he had only known for a short time. He had been raised with a sense of duty, yes, but it had always been to his country, to the people he had known his entire life. He had never imagined that his duty would extend to another world, to another species, and especially not to someone like Soraya. His mind raced with questions. What did it mean to be bound to her? What kind of life could he have here? These thoughts echoed in his mind at night, keeping him awake when he should have been sleeping. His heart was torn, his thoughts conflicted. He wasn't sure what he truly wanted anymore. Elias stood in the palace courtyard, his hands tucked into the pockets of his uniform. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens. The palace, towering above him, seemed to be watching over him, reminding him of his unavoidable reality. He had been offered a chance to return home. He could walk away from all of this, return to Earth, and never look back. But when he closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the thought of leaving Soraya behind. He thought back to the moments he had spent with her, the way she had trusted him, relied on him, and fought beside him. How could he walk away from someone who had already become such an integral part of his life? I cannot undo the bond, Elias. Soraya's words haunted him. It was true. There was no going back now, not for either of them. But that didn't mean he was powerless. He could still choose his path. The bond had formed, yes, but it didn't define him. The decision was his to make. Just then, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Soraya, her regal figure illuminated by the fading light of the sun. She was calm, as always, but Elias noticed the slight tension in her posture. She was waiting for him to make his choice. For a long moment, they simply stood in silence. Finally, Soraya spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You've been silent for days, Elias. What have you decided?" Elias turned to face her fully, taking a deep breath. The choice had been weighing on him, but he knew now that he couldn't keep avoiding it. He had to face the truth, his truth. "I've decided to stay," he said, his voice clear. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. This bond, it's not something I can walk away from. It's not just a tie between us. It's a future we're both creating, and I want to help build it." Soraya's golden eyes softened, and Elias could see the flicker of emotion behind them. Her lips parted, as if she was about to say something, but she paused, simply studying him. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "There is no going back, Elias. This is a lifetime decision." Elias nodded. "I'm sure. I'm not afraid anymore." A small smile tugged at the corners of Soraya's lips. "Then I welcome you as my partner, Elias Carter." For a moment, the world seemed to pause around them. The weight of his decision, the significance of their bond, seemed to settle between them in a quiet, unspoken understanding. They were no longer just two individuals, caught in a strange situation. They were united, and this connection between them was not a burden, but a shared path. Soraya took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "Together, we will change this world. Together, we will lead it into a new future." Elias smiled softly, a sense of peace washing over him. For the first time in days, his mind was clear. He had made the right choice. There were no more doubts, no more questions. As the sun set behind the palace, casting the courtyard in a warm golden glow, Elias realized that his life would never be the same again. But that was no longer something he feared. He wasn't just a diplomat anymore. He was part of something bigger, something that transcended planets and species, and with Soraya by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the future had in store. Together, they would face the challenges ahead. Together, they would shape the future of Velthera.